Hello and welcome to Opinion Roundup. I'm Associate Editor of the Moscow Times, Christopher Brennan, here with Opinion Editor of the Moscow Times, Michael Bohm, to talk about the ongoing situation in Ukraine and Mike's most recent article, 4 Reasons Why Putin's Crimea grab will backfire, in which he details a list of reasons why he thinks Russia will become increasingly isolated as a result of its annexation of Crimea. In your piece, you focus a lot on the repercussions of Russia's annexation of Crimea, kind of saying that all of these things will happen. The first question I have is whether, in the absence of Russian troops going to eastern Ukraine, we're going to see larger scale sanctions against the Russian economy from both the US and Europe, and this kind of global isolation that you talk about. Will that actually happen if Russia does not send troops into Donetsk, etc.?
Obama is clear on the issue. He said these level of sanctions will stay unless there'll be further intervention by Putin, by Russia. Then there'll be more severe sanctions. But the issue is not so much sanctions, is the global isolation. And Obama, when investors, Russian included, leave the country, leave with their money, that has nothing to do with Obama. Obama didn't order them to do it. It's their lack of faith in Russia, in the political situation. So that's where Russia will get hurt the most.
So in the idea of global isolation from Russia, there's kind of two parts as I see it. There's Russia and the outside world, Western powers, as well as Russia and Ukraine. But in terms of isolation from the international community at large, you referenced the fact that 13 out of 15 members of the Security Council at the UN kind of condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea, with an abstention being from China and Russia voting against it. However, in the General Assembly, there was a fairly large number of abstentions, including BRIC countries, South Africa, Brazil, China, India. Do you think in this idea of global isolation, is that just isolation from US powers? I mean, the US has been leading this idea of Russia as the aggressor, as well as, of course, Ukrainian authorities. In the eventual kind of repercussions from all of this, do you see relationships with places like India and China really being damaged over the annexation?
Yeah, I think it really is global. I mean, it was 100 versus 11, and if you look at the 11, who are the 11? Sudan, Zimbabwe, Cuba, North Korea. These, not much of a support. And the abstentions, I wouldn't put too much credibility in abstentions. Abstentions don't mean anything. They can go either way. The U.S., the West could say, well, it's our support. Russia could say it's our support. It doesn't mean anything. The best way to look at it is 100 versus 11, and that's not very good for Russia.
The other part of Russia's global isolation would be from Ukraine, which was obviously part of the Soviet Union up until the 1990s, and has been a partner with Russia in many endeavors since then, in the past 20 years. Do you see the relationship with Ukraine being completely shut off now? I mean, you talk about Ukraine joining NATO, with which Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has kind of said against, that that's not really on the table, about joining the European Union, which is of course a possibility. And other world leaders have said that Ukraine shouldn't have to choose between Russia and the West. Do you see the relationship with Ukraine being completely over now with this annexation, or do you think Ukraine still needs Russia as a partner going forward?
Clearly, Ukraine's ability to become independent of Russia is limited. There's too much that the two economies are intertwined. There's really nothing Ukraine can do about it. I mean, it will look more to Europe, and Yatsenyuk already signed the association agreement, and the U.S. will play a large role in helping Ukraine become more independent of Russia, particularly in the energy security range. Already there's American companies in Ukraine, in Poland, that's developing shale gas. In 4 or 5 years, that'll be a big factor, and that'll help Ukraine become more oriented towards toward the West and be less dependent on Russia.
So you see, I mean, in the piece you discount the idea of a Eurasian Union happening, saying that Ukraine is too important. You see a general, complete lessening of ties with Russia, all the business interests that are entwined?
As much as possible. I mean, some will obviously stay. It'll take years before Ukraine becomes independent of Russia, and they'll never be completely. Yeah, I mean the Eurasian Union, the customs union that Putin wanted so much is over, and without Ukraine, it's pretty much meaningless.
You opened this piece with a comparison to George W. Bush, the U.S. president, who of course invaded Iraq and then whose rating fell to terrible lows by 2008 after a bump, the kind that Putin has seen, maybe up to 80%. Do you think that the sanctions and the repercussions are going to be blamed on Putin, or there is an easily accessible enemy in the United States? Do you think those sanctions repercussions are blamed on Putin or on Western powers?
I think in the beginning stages, yes, Putin and state propaganda will try to say your lower living standards are because of the U.S. That might work for a short period, but in 6 months, in a year, Russians are going to go to the store, they're going to see that their salaries are devalued, that the milk and bread is more expensive, and it's going to be harder to explain to Russians that milk is more expensive because of the United States. And unfortunately, this is for Putin. This is Putin's project. Everybody associates the annexation of Crimea with Putin. So if it doesn't work, if it fails, and I think it will, I think it'll come back. It'll backfire. It'll come back to haunt Putin. It's going to be his problem.
Even if there are no casualties in Crimea?
The casualty will be the economy, and it'll be the lower living standards of Russians. That's the casualties. If there's actual casualties, then it'll be even worse. I mean, if there's provocations, and there's already indications that that there's provocateurs in eastern Ukraine. If that leads to inter-ethnic conflict, then it'll be a complete disaster for Putin.
Speaking to Russian domestic policies, you, at the end of the piece, talk about this being a boon for the opposition, and when the economy kind of falls apart a little bit, the opposition will finally be able to make a push for a change in power that hadn't seen in previous times when the Russian economy was doing well. Do you think that will happen, or do you think there is the idea that people think of opposition leaders, maybe Alexei Navalny, as a fifth column in Russia, as Putin said during his speech about the annexation?
Navalny was the leader in 2010, 2012, after the election falsifications. But if the economy really gets bad because of the total global isolation, then Navalny will, I don't think he'll be a major figure in the opposition. Then you'll see other people who represent the broader scale in Russia, people who are upset that they can't make ends meet. I mean, Navalny is kind of the Moscow hipster leader. So you'll see a much broader movement, against Putin, and against lower standards of living, and so you won't have that. So Putin can't use that fifth column excuse. Now with Navalny, he can, because he's seen the kind of this Western. He's portrayed as a Western lackey. But the broader the opposition movement comes, the less effective that argument works.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Make sure to follow the discussions on the opinion pages of the Moscow Times and themoscowtimes.com.